Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just a few moments. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, the Basin Oyster Project, community-based coastal habitat restoration. The Basin Oyster Project seeks to build a sustainable oyster reef in a deep water tidal inlet of the new Meadows River, known as the Basin. Oyster reefs provide a wide range of ecological benefits, including improving water quality and biodiversity, increasing species abundance, providing storm surge protection, and mitigating climate change impacts. And the project draws support from across sectors of the local community. We are delighted to welcome 3 speakers to share the Basin Oyster Project's collaborative social scientific model for coastal restoration. Joining us today are Caitlin Cleaver, who is the director of the Bates Morse Mountain Conservation Area and the Coastal Center at Shortridge for Bates College, where she engages faculty and students in coastal research. Caitlin has close to a decade of experience working with coastal communities in marine resources and believes that coupling social science with natural science efforts is important in developing effective conservation strategies that adequately account for the human aspect of marine issues. We're also joined today by Dot Kelly, who is a member of the Phippsburg Conservation Commission and the Phippsburg Land Trust. Dot has led the Basin Oyster Restoration Project since January 2020. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Marissa McMahon, who is Director of Fisheries at Manomet, a Brunswick-based conservation nonprofit involved in the Basin Oyster Project. Marissa has spent over a decade researching fisheries in the Gulf of Maine, and her research focuses on restoring ecosystem productivity and strengthening and diversifying fisheries resources. What an incredible group of speakers we have today. Welcome to all of you. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 8,500 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from each of our speakers and then tackle questions for all 3 of them in the Q&A at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you, and I'll keep track of them and ask them during the Q&A at the end. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Will Sedlak and he will be the one to figure them all out for you. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you again for joining us. And Caitlin, I will turn it over to you to kick things off.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for that great introduction, and excited to see how many people are here today to learn about the Basin Oyster Project. Can everyone see my screen? Yes. Okay, great. Oh, I just hit escape and I should not have done that. Okay, great. So without further ado, I will get underway. So we've come up with a new title for our talk, From the Bottom Up, a community-based approach to oyster reef restoration. And so just a quick overview of what we'll touch on today. We will talk a little bit more about who we are and what role we're playing in this project. I think one of the most amazing things about the project is the diverse array of people involved and the expertise that they bring to something that they care very deeply about, which is the basin and oysters. I'll touch on oyster reefs and their benefits, and then why are we talking about oyster reefs in Maine. I'll turn it over to Dot, who will talk about the Basin Oyster Project history, and then Marissa will talk about what we've done to date. And I'll wrap up with what we're planning to do this winter and this coming spring and summer. So just quickly, again, I mean, Kathleen did an excellent job giving an introduction, but I'm Kate Cleaver, and I work at Bates College, and my goal is really to bring coastal research to local stakeholders to help them learn more about the environments that matter to them. And so I really am excited to do this for the Basin Oyster Project and to get Bates students involved in this project and get them involved in the local community. So Dot. Dot, you're muted.
Again, hello. Thank you so much for joining us today to hear about the Basin Oyster Project. I could not be more thrilled with the leadership group of about 10 people that are hard at work at trying to collaboratively encourage oysters as an economic driver, oysters as an educational driver, oysters as an environmental improvement driver. And it's both fun, challenging, and rewarding. The way we got involved was the Nature Conservancy had, well, let me just wait. Kate, am I supposed to go and have Marissa introduce herself now? Okay, Marissa, introduce yourself.
Thanks, Dot. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Marissa McMahon, and I'm the Director of Fisheries at Manomet. Manomet is a conservation nonprofit, and we use science-driven solutions to improve ecosystem health and human well-being. And our fisheries work really focuses on building resilience in fisheries and coastal ecosystems so that we can be better prepared for climate change. So this Basin Oyster Project was really a natural fit for us. And when we were asked to join, we were thrilled, and it was a very easy decision to say yes. So I personally have some background in oyster reef restoration in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So, I've been able to sort of put some of that background experience to use on this project. And we've also been able to link some of our sort of ongoing work at Manomet as well with this project, which has been really exciting. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of that work in just a little while. Thrilled to be here.
Great, thank you both. So what's a shellfish reef? So basically shellfish reefs are habitat that is formed by shellfish like oysters and mussel that like to live together. And so they can take many different forms. They can, be subtidal or intertidal, and they can create these large sort of exposed habitat here, or more like shellfish beds here, which are sort of like one layer of shellfish. And so they were pretty extensive throughout the US in the Gulf of Mexico and along the Atlantic coast. And back in the early 1900s, people harvested them for food and for building material. And even before that, for about 10,000 years, they've been harvested for food and building material. And then I love this picture here on the left because it shows sort of the scale of extraction that was happening in the early 1900s. And then the photo on the right shows that harvesting was happening both by hand, but then in the deeper waters by boat and rakes. And so we really did a number on this species. And then to exacerbate the overexploitation impacts, oyster reefs are built and depend upon dead shell and other oysters to continue building that habitat. So if you remove the shell from the system, you are essentially degrading the habitat upon which this reef depends. So, so there was a massive loss of oyster reef habitat throughout the US. And this figure really highlights it. This is from a Nature Conservancy report where I want to first say that this only includes places where there was historic data of oyster biomass and current day data of oyster biomass. So this doesn't necessarily represent everywhere that oyster reefs were found. But what I really want to draw your attention to is that there are very few places on this figure where there is, 100% of historic biomass, and that we actually see many more places where there's less than 50% of the historic oyster biomass. So it's really a habitat type that has been decimated by overexploitation and habitat degradation. But on a good note, on a happy note, there in the last decade, there has been attention turned to restoring these habitats. And that's largely because people have done the work to value the services that these habitats provide. So it's given justification to spending the money to restore these habitats, both on small scale and larger scale projects. And the reason that restoration is really important is that these reefs provide a number of ecosystem services. So starting with ecosystem function, the reefs themselves actually provide shelter and habitat surface for other organisms. This in turn creates a diverse system that allows for larger fish to feed in that area. And then they also, remove excess nitrogen and nutrients from the system, and they improve water clarity, which allows seagrasses and other marine organisms to grow. And then they stabilize the substrate and reduce erosion in that way. And then these reefs at larger scales can reduce wave energy and attenuate waves, which are associated with more intense and frequent hurricanes and other storm events, as well as just our more frequent high tide flooding that we're probably going to see as a result, or already seeing as a result of climate change. So it's really providing a lot of services to our coastal systems. They're found in estuaries, bays, and inlets. And these photos just show sort of that habitat provision and diversity, biodiversity on the left, and then on the right, sort of a reef providing a buffer or a barrier to rising seas. So they really provide a lot of services. And who benefits? Well, clearly this is from an anthropogenic perspective, but the shoreline property owners would clearly benefit from having that protection of their of the shoreline from erosion and from wave attenuation. And then recreational fishers, commercial fishers, as well as nature lovers, divers, and kayakers all benefit from improved water quality and increased biodiversity. And then not necessarily at the scale we're working at in the basin, but at much larger scale, projects are occurring in Long Island Sound and New York Harbor, and that can actually employ people in the construction of these large scale reefs. So a lot of people stand to benefit from the ecosystem services that oyster reefs provide. So why are we talking about this in Maine? So probably many of you have heard that the Gulf of Maine is warming at a rate much faster than a number of the other oceans. And this figure here just sort of shows that as a visual. This is sea surface temperature trend since 1870. And you can see that the Gulf of Maine, which is in that square there, is much darker. So that means it's warmer. And so this provides potential for oysters that tend to like warmer estuarine habitats. Their habitat range is expanding into the Gulf of Maine. And so there might be more potential for them to thrive here. And then the other trend that's happening here in Maine right now is increasing interest in oyster aquaculture. And so this figure is a little busy, but just bear with me while I walk you through it. So on the X or the Y axis, you have the number of active limited purpose aquaculture licenses, or LPAs. And on the y-axis, you have over time. And the bar that I want to draw your attention to, the color I want to draw your attention to, is this medium blue here, which is oyster aquaculture, oysters only. And you can see that it's increased over time. So there's been an interest in oyster aquaculture. And so that growth is making people more aware of aquaculture, making people more aware of oysters. And so we think of this project as this great blending of the potential ecological benefits of having more oysters in our coastal waters, while also providing an avenue for restoring or benefiting community relations between the aquaculture industry and the community, basically. So promoting the ecological services of oysters. And so what does the restoration process look like? It typically starts with setting the objectives and what your goals are for that restoration project. And then site selection follows next. And then defining the actions that need to be taken for restoration implementation. And then you monitor and evaluate how you're doing on meeting those objectives. And so with this project in particular, we've already had the site selection and the setting of objectives, and we are now moving into the restoration implementation and the monitoring and assessment. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Thank you, Caitlin. The Nature Conservancy in 2007 was given a gift of almost 2,000 acres by the Hatch family. And that included the acres or the shorefront surrounding the basin, as you can see from the map or chart on your screen. And the Nature Conservancy looked at the Hatch property and came up with a number of restoration projects, I think, for which I, as a Phippsburg resident and the town of Phippsburg, is very grateful. And one of those was, with the amount of shorefront that they had on the basin, was that they started thinking about and then implementing a shellfish restoration effort focused on oysters. They did that work from 2017 to 2019. I was involved tangentially. And then at the end of 2019, they did come to the Conservation Commission and suggested it would be nice if the Conservation Commission would take over the project and mold it and continue it, see if we could make it successful. That's what we've then gone to try to do, where COVID hit very quickly too. But even with the difficulty of COVID, the LPAs that they had permitted, we changed over to being under my name, under the Conservation Commission. And what you can see that the Nature Conservancy did here is they settled oyster spat onto tiles as well as onto shell, and then unprotected, put that into the water. And the results of their attempts were actually very positive in that they showed that the water supports mussels and oysters to continue to live, but unfortunately the yield suffered somewhat from tunicates and then also from green crabs. And we've actually looked at focusing on what is the impact of predators and what kind of predator control can we do to make the oyster growth more successful. In 2020, they transferred their LPA over to the Phippsburg Conservation Commission. We got this wonderful group of about 10 people on the inside, and then maybe another 20 collaborators out from that. And we've raised eyed larvae, which are fertilized egg and sperm of oysters. After about 10 days, they grow an eye and are then able to maneuver themselves around in the water column, and you can get them at that phase. And we would actually settle them onto a shell Then we would grow them out into the floating bags, and you can see a picture in the distance here where we're within the water. There's kind of a brownish spot. That's actually some oyster bags floating. And we've certainly rounded out our team and hope to continue that growth. We are looking to build on the idea that a community that supports oysters, oyster industry, oyster restoration, makes for an improved collaboration, and that there's actually a positive result in encouraging that communication, having people feel that they can be heard and actions taken. So we're looking to be that glue in addition. Here's a list of our current team members: myself, Marissa, Caitlin's towards the bottom, Jesse, who works with Marissa, John Harrigal, the head of Maine Oyster Company, Joe Jerome has a local fishing business, Dean Doyle is a farmer, oyster farmer and Shellfish Commission chair, Lydia and Chuck Wilson, they actually have a small LPA and are local volunteers with the Basin Oyster Project, Rebecca Schultz, who's a basin landowner, which is very nice. So you get the perspective of impact. And she's also a coastal ecology person, so has some expertise. Caitlin and Pete Dunbar, a student at Bates, and we hope to increase our internship, people who can learn from the challenges and successes that we are doing. Thank you. Oh, I guess I have a couple more. We have done some education, both with local community groups as well as with schools, and we plan to continue with that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Marissa.
Great. Thanks again, Dot. So I'm going to sort of walk us through a look at our research questions. So first and foremost, is it possible to build oyster reefs in Maine? It's really never been done before. This is sort of further north than we typically see restoration efforts. In the Northeast, most of the restoration efforts that we've seen are in places like New Hampshire, Massachusetts. So first and foremost, can we do this? Can we build an oyster reef? And then if we're successful in building an oyster reef, what are the potential benefits that we might expect? And there are things ranging from changes in biodiversity to looking at what sort of structure and habitat that the reef provides. How does that habitat change over time? What are the effects to oyster dynamics? So things like spawning and growth and mortality. And then, what are the impacts to water quality as well? And so these are sort of some of the questions that we're thinking about. And then once we're able to start answering some of these questions, we'd ultimately like to synthesize the lessons that we've learned and be able to create guidance documents for other communities that might be interested in doing this type of work. So I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the monitoring that we're doing and some of the work that's going to help us understand and inform this process. So the first is monitoring green crabs. So green crabs are a harmful invasive species that has been in the US since 1817. They were brought here in ship ballast water, and they've been increasing in abundance in recent years as water temperatures have warmed. So they're really more of a problem now than they have ever been before. So we're focusing on them in connection to this oyster building project because they are a predator of oysters, as well as softshell clams and mussels. Mussels and softshell clams in particular have really been dramatically in decline in recent years due to green crab predation. And green crabs also compete with native species like rock crabs and Jonah crabs, potentially lobsters as well. So, back to sort of the really direct connection to our work, small oysters in particular are really susceptible to predation by green crabs. So one of the things that we're, thinking about doing is growing them larger before we actually put them out to build the reef. So growing them large enough that they've sort of outgrown green crab predation, to help sort of increase chances of survival and the success of the reef. But ultimately, to improve our understanding of the green crab threat in this very specific area, we're conducting monthly surveys to monitor crab populations at the reef site and track how the population is changing over time. So essentially, this data is, going to be able to inform, the work that we're doing and understanding this predator threat in this area. This data also contributes to long-term monitoring efforts that have been going on. Manomet has been leading some green crab monitoring efforts since 2017 at sites ranging from Yarmouth all the way to Damariscotta. And so we're using the same protocol that we use at all of these other sites. Essentially, we go to the low intertidal and we sample 10 meters squared. And we're looking at things like the density of crabs, measuring the carapace width, so we understand the size of the crabs in the population, we sex them, et cetera. And this is allowing us, by using the same protocol, allowing us to sort of compare what this population in the basin looks like compared to other populations at other sites that we monitor. And we're really focused mostly on density because we want to see how density changes in these crab populations over time, but also compared to the densities that we see at other sites. So next up is monitoring water quality. I'll just wait till the slide, and there we go. In terms of water quality, one oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. So this makes them incredibly valuable for improving water quality. So we're doing monitoring before, during, and after the reef is established to track changes in things like dissolved oxygen, pH, or essentially how acidic the water is. Ocean acidification is, an impact of climate change that we're experiencing. Turbidity, so looking at the amount of suspended sediment that can potentially block light and also carry contaminants. And then we're also recording things like temperature and salinity and weather. And we're using established protocols. So we're using the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust's protocol so that we can compare not just the changes at this site, but also contribute to long-term monitoring and compare what we're finding to different sites as well. And also this is building on 20 plus years of data that's been collected by the Friends of Casco Bay. And then finally, we're doing scuba surveys. So looking at the site to determine what the substrate looks like prior to building the reef, and then monitoring the success of the reef over time. So measuring things like how the reef is growing horizontally and vertically over time. And the scuba surveys also allow us to look at biodiversity in the area. So Caitlin and Jesse actually did an initial scoping dive, I think it was last month, to take a look, sort of a first glimpse at the substrate and the biodiversity at the site and better understand, sort of what we're working with. And then in 2020, in the spring, we're going to start doing some mapping, substrate mapping, to really understand exactly what the substrate looks like on a fine scale within the LPA where the reef will be built. And then also begin collecting information on things like biodiversity. And we'll be doing that again before the reef is established, during and after, so we can monitor the changes that we're seeing in things like substrate and how the reef is growing and biodiversity. So with that, I will hand it back over to Kate.
Great. Thank you, Marissa, and thanks, Dot. So this winter, we are putting out a small plot to experiment with this predation hypothesis that we have, that our site is riddled with green crabs. So we need to be cognizant of that in our restoration planning. So we are putting a plot of, I believe, 200 individuals in a predator control net and 200 individuals in the environment, and we'll see how they do this winter. And then we are going to apply for a second site, a second LPA, and this will allow us to do some comparisons between sites. So if you remember, our site is pretty close to the opening to the new Meadows River. So we're hoping to do a site further in the basin and just have some comparisons between those two and be able to get at site characteristics that are more conducive to oyster reef restoration than others. And then we also are scouring the literature to review restoration best practices and really tailor those to our site and what we know about the ecology of the basin. And through that, we will develop a site-specific restoration plan. And then also, education and outreach is one of our top priorities as well. So Pete, our Bates student, is actually working on 5th grade curriculum that we hope to get into the local schools, possibly this school year, but realistic. We're still in the COVID pandemic, but so in some time we will implement that curriculum. And then in the summer, we will continue with our monitoring. We hope to add settlement plates. So this idea of eventually we want the reef to be self-seeding and have reproductive oysters as part of it. So settlement plates are a way of tracking larval abundance in that area. And we're also going to pair that with some modeling of the hydrology and the currents in that area. We will continue the water quality sampling, the green crab surveys. We will start the biodiversity sampling. And then also one thing that Pete wants to work on is sedimentation rates of the different sites in the basin. So obviously you wouldn't want to plant oysters in a place where they would get covered with sediment because that would smother them. So as a geology student, he's interested in sort of finding out exactly what the sediment is doing in the basin. And then we'll also prep the sites for planting oysters, the substrate mapping that Marissa mentioned, and the green crab predation experiments. We were thinking about doing some tank experiments with different sized oysters and different sized green crabs to understand if we can get at that size refuge above which oysters will be protected from green crab predation. And then obviously we'll continue our outreach efforts. And with that, we will take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate and Dot and Marissa. What a fabulous presentation. And I know we've got a lot of questions to get through, but before we do, I'm just going to take a moment. Our Lunch and Learn regulars know that this is the part of the program where we share a call to action, a way for each of us to continue learning and engaging with the topic of the day. I love this week's call to action because it sounds really fun and it's Friday, so we're heading into the weekend. Let's all go eat oysters. We can check out the Maine Oyster Company or support our favorite oyster farmers and feel good about our treats. You can also stay connected with the Basin Oyster Project by sending an email to basinoysterproject@gmail.com. Don't worry, I rushed right through that, but you'll get an email later this afternoon with that email address and a little bit more about some of the great oyster ways to enjoy and celebrate Maine oysters this afternoon. All right, let's get into the questions. Kate, I wonder if we can start with you. I know in your career, you've worked with lots of folks in identifying tools to preserve working waterfronts and facilitating community participation in the ocean planning process and all sorts of good things. What have you learned about developing effective conservation strategies that really do account for the human aspect of these marine issues that we're all thinking about?
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I think it's about getting diverse stakeholders to the table and leaning heavily on community leaders. So, with all of these sorts of projects where you're doing them in community, you need community buy-in and community trust. And that really starts with the people, right? So we can bring our knowledge that, we get from our academic training and our experience carrying out monitoring projects and whatnot. But when the rubber needs to meet the road, you need the people involved and bought in. And so I can't talk enough about Dot's enthusiasm, as well as John Harrigal from Maine Oyster Company, and Dean Doyle. I mean, so we kind of had the wild fishery, the aquaculturists, and a community member who's on the Conservation Commission. So that is like the perfect suite of people involved. So I really think it's the team that matters so much.
Well, you've given us just a little glimpse of the amazing team behind Basin Oyster Project. So thank you. I can see the power of that team. You bring lots of different kinds of experience. And so I couldn't resist digging into your backgrounds a little bit. And Dot, you just demonstrate your enthusiasm for the environment in so many ways. And we could talk all day about your advocacy for estuaries, for utility ratepayers. I mean, you do it all. But I have to ask about one thing that really jumped out at me from your resume. You were the Director of Energy and Environmental Services for a major chemical company. Tell us more.
Thank you, Kathleen. Hard to put that into just a few minutes. I think I felt incredibly grateful and lucky to get recognized as a woman in a very male-dominated world, the high technology chemical industry, to actually do the job that I definitely wanted to do. So I'd started as a chemist. I'd gone to Yale and did chemistry for a while, quickly went into technical sales and then into marketing, and had always wanted to be in the environmental area. And so I asked them to please let me be in the environmental area, and they did. And I felt that it was a combination of someone who works hard with integrity. And you can see from this group that we have people who are doing that every day. They're passionate about what we're trying to do, and they're working hard. And I felt that as the head of energy and environmental services for big corporations, that to truly understand the problem and then to understand the different aspects of the solution, so you're holistically thinking about your solutions, is the secret. Then if you can work hard with integrity and communicate what you're doing, it's all good. And here I am doing that with the Basin Oyster Project and just enjoying it tremendously. So I hope that helped.
Thank you, Dot. It really does. And I also just love that takeaway that you follow your interests and your passions and ask for the position you want. Get yourself in there, right? You can do it. Thank you, Dot. All right, Marissa, it's your turn. You're a scientist, a researcher, you're an ecosystem expert. You also have deep connections to the fishing traditions and culture of New England. Your family has been fishing in mid-coast Maine since the 1700s, is that right? Wow. How does that experience growing up in a longtime fishing family impact your work as a fisheries scientist?
That's a great question. Well, I would say that, that was sort of my inspiration for going into fisheries science, was just growing up in that world and from a very young age being exposed to the marine environment and just being really curious and having a lot of questions. But, I would say, what also sort of inspired me was seeing that there, was sort of an underrepresentation of the voice of fishers and fishing communities in a lot of the research and management that was occurring. And so it seemed like, an opportunity to kind of be a bridge between those two worlds. And so a lot, and I would say probably all of my research really, it starts from a place of listening to fishers, listening to the issues that coastal communities are grappling with, and then, really working to sort of co-produce and co-develop ways to sort of tackle those issues and come up with solutions that are, beneficial to the communities and find ways to really sort of elevate the voices of fishers and community members. So yeah, that's sort of a little of my background.
Thank you. It's really astounding to think about, we know that this idea of broad representation and stakeholder involvement and all of that, we know that's best practices, but what it actually looks like and feels like for people has to do with the approach, right? And that openness, that listening, that co-creation of solutions is fundamentally different than going to a group of folks and saying, we came up with this, will you sign off on it? So thank you. I really hear that and really appreciate it. Couple of just definitions and let's make sure we all understand what we're talking about here. You all were talking about, in the creation of the reef, a settlement plate. Tell us what that is again.
Yeah, sure. So a sediment plate is basically a technique that's used for different species that have larvae that settle out of the water column and land on substrate. And so, literally this is like a tile that you can buy at Home Depot that you put out at a certain time of year in hopes of catching oyster larvae. And then, for scallops, they use something called a spat bag, which is plastic mesh put into another mesh bag. And the idea is that the larvae passes through the smaller mesh and attaches to the mesh inside and then grows slightly, so it can't get back out. So those are just sort of metrics or ways to understand what the larval abundance is in a particular area. Marissa, do you have anything to add to that? No. So we'll put them out in June, and then maybe again later in the summer, and then possibly again in the fall, to try and catch, different larval pulses that might happen with oysters.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you.
So I find one of the challenging aspects of this project is going to be the spawning. We do have, one of the reasons why the basin was a good site for the Nature Conservancy to pick for looking at oysters is that in the 50s, there was a program under DMR that introduced the European oyster, the Balan oyster, and they have survived. There's not, just like the clams and the mussels and the oysters as well are suffering from predation. You don't see new colonies of the European oysters, but you do see a number of mature European oysters. We also have mature 10-year-old American oysters. So these are likely oysters that were from either hatcheries or the other farms that might have had some spawned oysters or escaped oysters. And they have grown in the basin. So we know that we have a pretty good spot. There is some natural spawn. The American oyster requires a higher temperature to spawn than the European oyster, which was why they looked to the European oyster in the 50s. So now the water is getting into that 70 to 80 degree on a very warm day. And we're going to be trying to track it closely. So one of the keys is to look carefully at what's going on, and then maybe we can make progress from that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, in some ways, you're saying the temperature changes are what allow this project.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, the results of this project are going to tell us something about what's going on with the temperature. and there's this sort of almost like a sentinel role that the Basin Oyster Project could play as we think about the predictable and the not so predictable impacts of climate change. How do you track those? What do you do with them? What does that feedback loop look like?
I can jump in. I think, a lot of it is, doing the monitoring to inform sort of how we continue with the project in terms of, a lot of like the green crab monitoring. When and where we're finding green crabs is informing, when and where we are actually building the reef, where we're, when we deploy it, what size to deploy oysters at, things like that. And then, in terms of looking at sort of the environmental covariates as well, you're right. It's part of it is just understanding how, things are changing because of climate change impacts, but then also looking at, is this a potential mitigation strategy? Are we able to lessen those impacts to some extent, to buffer those impacts with this, construction of oyster habitat? And then if so, if we can, track changes that seem beneficial in that way, then how do we think about that at a larger scale and take sort of what we're seeing at this smaller scale pilot sort of project and maybe think about how you could apply that coastwide?
And I would just add, I like to think of this as sort of silver lining of climate change. So it's it's a project where, oysters are going to benefit from warming waters to a point. Ocean acidification is also not great for oysters. So like it's positive in that light, but obviously there's also a shadow to it. But the other thing that I've been thinking a lot lately with this project in particular is that there's a new emphasis on blue carbon and the role that coastal systems play in carbon sequestration. And so, if we couple this development of this oyster reef, and that actually improves water quality to the point where seagrass and eelgrass can thrive, that's playing a role in carbon sequestration. And so, if we sort of have this proof of concept and it works and we're successful in it, it could be a model that's used elsewhere. And I think restoration of our coastal systems is just so important for so many things, So it's exciting to be a part of that.
It is, and not to reveal my natural impatience, but what's the timeline? When do we know if it's working? How quickly can we scale this up? Let's do it all.
That is the $1 million question. No, I think it's so many facets. So we're right now permitting this through the aquaculture leasing process, and we're doing it on 400 square feet. It's likely that if we were to scale this up, we would need a different sort of set of permitting. So like we want to find that out. And we learned that the Maine Coastal Program and a group in Casco Bay is working on sort of that larger scale project. So there's like the regulatory side of things. And then from an ecological standpoint, the oysters grow pretty quickly. I think Dot could speak to that more than I can. So we're hoping to plant oysters this time next year, if not sooner, and start to see how they do. But Dot, I don't know if you want to talk about how quickly the oysters are growing.
I think that we, at the end of this coming year, will be a lot further along than we are right now. Just as we've had to make changes to reflect what the Nature Conservancy found with their 3-year project, 2017 through the end of 2019, I think we can look at this like another 3-year project where not this time next year, but this time 2 years from now, we'll know a fair amount. And I'm very hopeful that doing a concerted reach out to people who've already tried their best to make good reef building decisions and learning from their mistakes and encouraging them to help us is, and then we plan to publicize that information, which is a little hard to access right now. So we think that if nothing else, we'll have moved the ball forward, forward up the hill.
I love that, Dot. And I hope that we can all pencil this in for 2 years from now, and we'll bring you guys back, if not before, for the update on what have we learned.
Oh, have us come back next year this time.
That's right. Let's just make this an annual thing. Maybe next year we'll gather in person and eat some oysters while we're at it. let's talk about green crabs for a few minutes though. Are the oysters going to attract more green crabs? Will they attract more other invasive species? Like what, or do we just have to wait and see?
So green crabs will go where there's food. You know, I think we can definitely expect there to be green crabs in abundance in and around this reef, at least for the foreseeable future. But again, you know, part of what we're doing is trying to learn from best practices from other oyster reef building projects. And so we do have a fairly good idea of when oysters can outgrow green crab predation. And so at least for the sort of initial reef building activities, we know sort of what size range we should be aiming for so that they are less vulnerable to predation. But in terms of sort of the long-term growth of the reef, you know, it's certainly less certain. I think, you know, we can expect green crab predation to probably be a problem for the foreseeable future, but you know, at the same time, there are a lot of efforts underway to sort of develop ways to use green crabs and to sort of incentivize people to pull them out of the water. And so, you know, in an area like the basin that is this very sort of, you know, small area that's semi-enclosed, and you could really target sort of trapping and efforts like that, you might actually be able to have an impact on a very localized population of green crabs. You know, I don't necessarily see the green crab population as a huge impediment. I think it certainly is one hurdle, but I think that it is definitely one that we can manage.
One of our participants today suggested that the real call to action should be that we go out and catch and eat green crabs and share some recipes.
Absolutely. I am all about that.
So we'll add that to the list. Are there any promising predators of green crabs?
So everything eats green crabs. There is not a lack of predators, which is really interesting. In particular for an invasive species, often, you know, you see it being such a problem because there are no natural predators in a newly invaded area. That's not the case for green crabs. You know, fish eat them, other crustaceans eat them, diving ducks eat them, seagulls eat them, raccoons eat them, you know, so there's a never-ending list of predators. What's interesting is that it doesn't seem to be enough to exert control on the population, right? So despite the fact that there is a huge list of predators of green crabs, they are still growing rapidly in abundance.
They're survivors, huh?
They are.
Are they, and do they affect other shellfish as well? I mean, do we need to, how big of a problem are they?
Well, so yeah, I mean, it depends, you know, species by species, you can look at it. They're considered the main cause of the decline in the soft shell clam industry. So huge impact there, both ecologically, but also economically. They are definitely a problem for habitat like eelgrass and salt marshes. They can destabilize those types of habitats and cause erosion. But at the same time, they have been here since, or at least in the US, since 1817. So they are also a part of our ecosystem, and they're a well-established part of the ecosystem. So, you know, they have all of these very harmful sort of impacts, but they're also an important part of the food web, right? Again, going back to the fact that there's all sorts of predators that eat them. So they're an important part of the diet of many species. You know, so it's not quite as simple as they're just this horrible scourge that we need to eradicate. And we, you know, don't really have any shot at actually eradicating them because they're just so abundant. But there's, you know, there's some sort of important roles that they play as well. And they could potentially be a new opportunity if we can, you know, work towards developing fisheries and markets.
We're so, and I'm guilty of this as well, we're so ready to sort of cast species as good guys and bad guys, right? So I feel like that's a huge piece of learning. And, you know, we have a question about the 5th grade curriculum that you mentioned, and was just thinking maybe that's the biggest piece. It's all connected, and it's not about good guys and bad guys. It's just about the health of the ecosystem overall. What else do you see going in, assuming that you're going to take my advice on that one? What else do you see going into the 5th grade curriculum?
Dot, do you want to speak more to that, since you just had that Wainfleet event with, I forget what grade they were?
Yes, so we had an educational event with 59 4th and 5th graders, and it was at a farm, at the Merritt Island farm, where they did come down to the farm, and we had 4 different stations. I did the oyster science portion, where we had an exhibit over the period that they were there showing the filtering that oysters can provide as compared to just a 10-gallon tank that had the algae in it without the oysters. We also talked about the different shellfish that were around and had samples of those, so a table of shellfish. And we also had a see how hard the oyster shell is. You know, it is kind of, and then the biology of an oyster is actually quite interesting. So I think that a 5th grade curriculum, the best focus is if you can put that spark of enthusiasm for the outdoor world in a 5th grader's hand, that if you look carefully at something and evaluate its properties with a kind of a scientific eye, so that teaches you some scientific method, some ways to evaluate, but just to be in wonder, like this is happening all around. And so we're going to try to package all that into something that is reproducible, that if you were, you know, interested in recreating it with a 5th grade somewhere, you'd be able to try it, maybe improve on it. We're not having to create from whole cloth. Chesapeake has a 5th grade curriculum, and so it will be more a matter of putting it together and trying to improve it a little.
It all comes back to that teamwork, doesn't it? So folks want to know, how can we help? Do you need volunteers? Can we help start our own sites? Can we drop off our oyster shells after we've eaten the good parts? What do you need from us?
Dot, I'm looking at you because I feel like you're.
I think we definitely want, first and foremost, to find people who are interested in hearing what we're doing and would like to participate in some way, even just helping guide us. So many of you on this call have a wealth of information from a variety of experiences. And, you know, if we can think of you as partners and mentors, we are going to be doing a newsletter at the end of this month. So that's coming out very, very shortly. That would be a first go round. If you're close by and you want to see what it looks like, we'd love to show you what it really looks like, and also just to get your thoughts. So put your email down when you get that Gmail address, shoot us back. If you can give a little bit of extra information, we always like that, but we don't require it. You can just give us your email address.
And Kathleen, to your point, you know, I do think this effort is so site specific, or restoration as a science is very site specific. So yes, if you have a place where you want to do it, hopefully we would be able to share lessons learned and help you get started if that was of interest to you, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Caitlin, Marissa, Dot. Thanks everybody for joining us today. This is just such a fascinating topic, and I'm feeling full of hope and excitement about what's coming next. So yes, we'll definitely have you all back to keep us posted. And between now and then, we'll come out and visit you. Thank you. Everybody, we'll be back next week in this space for another in our series of just our racial and economic justice learning that we've been doing together. So next week's program is The Forgotten History of African Americans in Castine, Maine. Since May of 2020, the Castine Historical Society has been working with the community to help uncover the hidden and forgotten history of African Americans in Castine. So the executive director, Lisa Simpson-Lutz, will be with us to share what the Historical Society's been up to, what they've been learning, and how we can all get involved. So I hope you'll join us. And till then, have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.